fratele Ciprian Boitor. Dumnealui are PhD în psychology, în Christian psychology și ne cunoaștem de mulți ani din California. Am mare respect pentru dânsul și coordonează family ministry și family ministry, cum mă întreba mai devreme fratele Panican, se întâlnește probably every other month or so. And vă încurajăm să participați la întâlnirile acestea. Fratele Ciprian împreună cu echipa dânsului organizează aceste întâlniri de familie și acolo sunt subliniate elemente pe care noi astăzi le aducem. Încă o dată mulțumim fratelui Romeo, v-am spus că dumnealui coordonează departamentul de consiliere, dar are mulți consilieri sub el și puteți apela cu încredere cu problemele cu care vă confruntați. God bless you, my friend.
Thank you for the introduction. It's an honor to be here, and I know it's been a fruitful and eventful morning, so my presentation / workshop will be rather brief, and then we'll have lunch. So keep that in mind, but thank you. I'm privileged to be here and share with you all today. So the title of the workshop is How to Move from Resentment to Forgiveness by God's Grace. I'll be preaching primarily in English, as that's kind of a little more comfortable for me, but that's the topic of, I want us to be looking at what are the resentments that we might have, and how do we move from those into forgiveness. And this workshop is intended to be practical to work on specific resentments. So I'm thankful for the gentlemen that are passing out. It's one piece of paper. You could just hold on to it. You're not going to need it till toward the end of the workshop, but it's just something to hold on to, as well as the pen, because I'll be asking if you feel comfortable to engage with the worksheet and do a bit of writing for your own life. So the first test, and this is some of the topic earlier was around kind of hurt and anger, maybe in the marriage, in the relationship. This topic is going back to resentment in general toward anybody. So just broad resentments that may be in my life. And what do I do with them? How do I deal with them? So we're going back to that. Brother Romeo also preached on what does reconciliation look like. So this is kind of stepping back into what do I do? What work needs to be done in my life before I go to that other person? So just to put it in context of kind of what this tool is helpful for. Now, this is a very practical test of the resentments, because maybe you don't have any resentments. Maybe you've dealt with them. Maybe you're full of forgiveness and joy and happiness. Or maybe you're holding on to some, or you've walked in here pretty calmly. But the very practical test of resentment is this. It is now 12:20. It's lunchtime, and it smells good in here, right? But there's no lunch in front of you. So I imagine that most of you are getting hangry, and your number one resentment is me. When is this guy going to be quiet so we can go eat lunch? So you could add that as the first list of your resentment. Please don't do that. That's just a joke. But resentments pop up all the time, right? Sometimes they're deep, that maybe we've held on to for years. Sometimes it might be something in the moment. Somebody said something, did something, looked at us the wrong way, right? Something pretty temporary. I want to guide us through some biblical passages, and then we'll get to this worksheet. So let's look, if you have your Bible, if not, I'll just read it. But if you join me to stand just for the main passage, and then I'll invite you to sit. But if you'd stand, Matthew chapter 7, verse 3 to 5. Take a minute to give you a chance to get there. So Matthew chapter 7, verse 3 to 5. Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the beam in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye, when all the time there is a plank in your own eye? Hypocrite, first take the plank out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. Amen. Please be seated. So, this movement from resentment to forgiveness requires self-examination. It requires the ability to notice what I have, what's going on inside of me, what I'm holding on to, and give it up to God. And this is just one process. I imagine there's other ways to deal with it, but I think these are some biblical principles. So let's break down this passage. those of you that were listening or read the passage, Jesus is painting a picture, and it's actually quite humorous. He's painting a picture, and imagine, right, those of you that have done construction or seen construction, imagine a 2x4, right, this beam, and it's not something pretty small. Imagine something pretty big, and it's just in your eye, right? You all see that? Here's the beam, and it's in your eye, and when it first gets there, it's pretty uncomfortable, right? But if it's been there for a while, maybe you even forget about it. You can't see it anymore because it's maybe become part of you. At first, it's uncomfortable. Maybe you're walking around and you're bumping into people, right, because you're turning and you can't see clearly, and you're bumping into people. Maybe you're hurting them, but it has been there with you for so long that it's just there. You don't even notice it. Other people see it, right? They can point out, hey, this person has this going on in their life. They can see the beam. But because I've had it with me for so long, it has become a part of me, right? And so what does this plank represent? Well, Matthew chapter 7, verse 1 says, "Do not judge, or you too will be judged. For in the same way you judge others, you will be judged. And with the measure you use, it will be measured to you." And then it says, "Why do you look at the speck of sawdust?" So the couple of verses before, Jesus tells us, hey, we've got a beam in our eye, right? It tells us that it's about judgment. What do I do in my heart with that other person, my brother or sister, parent, whoever it is, coworker? What do I do toward them? Am I judging them? Am I holding on to something? So in these first verses, we see that the beam represents or can be seen as my judgment of others. I am holding on to this to the point where it's not a beam. It's almost like a hand. It has become a part of me, and it's become a part of my life. And if somebody were to try to remove it, that would feel uncomfortable because this thing has become a part of who I am. One form of judging others is to hold on to a resentment toward a person or a situation. I have decided that that person or that situation is so terrible, and I judge myself as better than them, right? It's not just any kind of judging. I am putting myself higher than them. And it's similar to walking around with a 2x4 in my eye when I'm doing that. It may get in the way, it may look strange, but it keeps people away. It keeps them at a distance, right? Maybe I've been hurt and I'm holding on to that resentment, and I keep them at a distance because I keep bringing that up. Well, what happens when I hold on to that resentment? And I want us to keep that image in our mind of I have a beam in my eye. And it seems silly, it seems ridiculous, but imagine there's a beam in your eye. Just literally there's a beam in your eye. What are the consequences of that, right? You can't see straight. Sure, the person may have done something to me, but I'm the one that's holding on to it. And what happens when I hold on to it? It becomes a focus of mine. It becomes heavy, and it's long, and it gets in the way of life, but I have held on to it for so long that it just continues to grow, and it becomes a part of who I am. I am now a resentful and bitter person, right? And that thing has taken root. And that takes time. It's not just a one-time thing, right? But it can get bigger, and that's why Jesus points it out and describes it as a beam. It's not something that's just a small thing, right? So resentment specifically is a roadblock to forgiveness, right? To experiencing God's forgiveness and love and to giving it to others. What does resentment mean? If you break it down, re and sent. I looked it up. There's two different parts of it. Re is to go back and to do it again. And a couple years ago, I was listening to somebody talk about it, and they explained the other part is actually sentir, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, which means to feel, to have emotions around, to live, right? And so if you put those two together, a resentment, what would that mean? To relive, to re-feel. And that really gives me a clue about what a resentment is. It's something that happened to me in the past, but I bring it up, I go back to it, and I feel it again as if it's happening right now, right? And how often do we do that? How much time do we spend in our past versus being grateful for what we have in the moment? So it means to feel again. It's a deep bitterness that lasts. Let me give you an example. If you ever watched football or basketball or watch some kind of sport on TV, right? With football, they play a game, the person gets tackled, hits the ground, and his head bounces sometimes, gets a really hard tackle. And the announcer goes, let's look at that again. That was pretty terrible. What do? Instant replay, right? And they do it in slow motion, and you see the guy hit the ground, And then he kind of bounces a little bit, and you see the pain on his face. And the announcer's talking about it. Look at the guy, look at the angle. That's an injury for sure, right? And they replay it multiple times. By that time, the guy is off the field. The event happened, it's over, but what is the announcer doing? What is the audience doing, right? They're reliving something that happened over and over. They're bringing it back up. So that's an example you can see in a football example, a sport example. Resentment is something like that. The moment has gone by. It happened years ago or a week ago or even an hour ago, and I bring it back to life again, right? I'm the one that sits there, thinks about it. I can see the person. I can replay it. So Jesus describes it as judging. And going back to this image, and I want us to remain with that. I'm gonna bring it up. I have a giant beam in my eye, right? What are the complications of that? And I'm holding it, right? It's not just sitting there. I have to be the one holding the beam. And Jesus describes it as judging. But we also know that Jesus describes himself as the great physician, right? And he is the great eye doctor. And he holds up a mirror so we can see ourselves. That's part of the cure that he offers us, right? He's saying, we are like that person with the beam in our eye, right? And we want to go help somebody else, but we can't. And so basically he's using humor, right? He's saying, you've got a log in your eye, and you want to take the tiny speck of sawdust, right? If you've cut something, sawdust is like this little tiny thing. Somebody's got a little bit, and imagine you're trying to walk up to that person to point that out, and you've got this log in your eye, right? In Romanian, I'm going to try to translate it. Ai un copac în ochi și vrei să scoți ochii vecinului care o așchi în ochi, right? You want to go to the neighbor. That's a loose translation. I was trying to be funny. But basically, your situation, the thing that you hold on to is this big deal, but you're focused on what that person has done. And Jesus points out that it's just a tiny speck, right? So he's using humor to get us to experience humility. Man, maybe I have something big that I'm holding on to and I'm focusing on this other person. So that's the first step. It's a process, right? How do we move from the resentment to forgiveness? The first step is allowing God, allowing Jesus, the Bible, to hold up a mirror so we can see this thing, right? People might have told us, but we're like, no, I'm good, right? But Jesus is telling us, and he's asking us to examine ourselves. What do we do from there? We can't fix ourselves. We need Jesus to help us see our condition, and that's where the Holy Spirit comes in to convict, to show, to bring to life, right? Matthew 7:7 tells us how to do that. We ask, and it is a persistent asking. Verse 7, ask and it'll be given. Seek and you will find. Knock and the door will be open to you. Right? Verse 11, if you then who are evil know how to give good gifts, how much more will your Father in heaven give good gifts to those who ask him? This sums up the law and the prophets. So Jesus is telling us, see yourself, see your condition. Let's see ourselves for who we are. What do we do with that? Then we knock, we ask, we persist, we seek, right? It's not a one time and I'm done. It requires a lot of work, and that's part of what that worksheet is about. There's going to be work that is required on our part. With resentment, especially if it's deep-rooted, right? Something that happened years ago, right? And I've replayed it, that doesn't get relieved that easily. So it's going to require work. And it talks about a gift. If I'm knocking and seeking, what gift is it that I'm seeking, right? It's the gift of forgiveness, of letting go of that resentment. It says, so in everything, this is the gift. Do to others what you would have them to do to you, for this sums up the law and the prophets. That's the gift that we're asking God the Father to give us. The ability, instead of, here's the opposite of the great commandment, right? Do to others as you would want them to do it unto you. The opposite is do one to others before they do one to you. You guys catch that? I'm going to do one to them. I have a resentment, and I'm going to hurt them, right? The opposite of that is what I ask God the Father to give me is the ability to pray for them, to let go of that resentment. And then it says, Matthew 5, verse 7, it says, blessed are the merciful, for they shall be shown mercy. So Jesus tells us that it's not simply enough to let go of that resentment. It's not simply enough to say, I'm going to forgive this person. It's, I need to be merciful because I am the one that will be shown mercy as I do that. Why is this important? He wants us to pursue mercy. It doesn't say to be merciful one time. I've treated this person kindly, right, just one time. It's blessed are the merciful. That means it's an attitude, it's a way of life, it's a consistent way of being. That's what Jesus is calling us to do. And then, going back to Matthew chapter 7, verse 5, it says, then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye, right? There's a process. If I go to my brother and I have a beam in my eye, I'm holding on to a resentment, how am I going to approach that person? What would that look like? Right? Impossible, right? And if I do try to approach them and I'm holding on to a resentment, what is going to be the outcome of me trying to interact or point out or correct? What's going to be the outcome of that? Yeah, right? As I try to get close to them, point out something, there's this beam in my eye of resentment of the way I talk, of the way I behave, of the way that I interact, and I will hurt that person. I can't see clearly because I'm blinded by my own resentment. And I might not even know it, right? And so Jesus is saying, when I'm able to let go of that resentment, then I'm able to be a blessing. I'm able to be merciful. I'm able to approach that person in a different way, the person that hurt me, right, in a different way because I've dealt with the resentment in my heart. I see differently. I see through the eyes of mercy. Now, I want us to look at an example, and then we'll head toward the conclusion and go to the worksheet. So let's look at Paul. 1 Timothy 1:15, Paul says, Christ, Jesus, came into the world to save sinners, of whom I am the worst. Right? In other places, Paul describes himself as righteous, right? Fulfilling the law, very zealous. He describes all his kind of credentials, right? But that was before Jesus Christ met with him and opened his eyes. Once he was able to see himself, he sees himself as the chief of sinners, right? His vision has been cleared. But before he became Paul, we see the resentment, hatred, and bitterness that was in his heart. So we're going to spend a little bit of time on that. In Acts chapter 9, verse 1 to 2, right? Before he became Paul, he was known as Saul. He had a different identity. And it says, meanwhile, Saul was still breathing out murderous threats against the Jews, right? This is even more than a resentment. It was so deep-seated, it was a hatred. And it wasn't just what he said, it was the way he breathed, right? It says he was breathing out murderous threats. And I've heard a sermon on that. When you have hatred and resentment, your breath changes, right? If you're scared or you're angry, you breathe faster because you're getting ready to fight the person. That's the way that Saul at that time was experiencing this. He was so focused on destroying the Christians that he was breathing out murderous threats. So that was his attitude. And we see him in Acts chapter 7 in action, right? Those of you that are familiar with the story of Stephen, right? He's there, he's proclaiming the gospel, he's describing the majesty of Jesus, and the crowd, the Pharisees, get enraged. And they get ready to stone him. And it says that there was somebody there, they laid down their coats, right, at somebody's feet. Who was that? Right? Saul was there, witness to this, and the verse says Saul was there giving approval to his death, right? That's how blind he was at the time and how he was blinded by his hatred. Now, that's an extreme example, right? Those of us here deal with resentments not to that degree, but it's an extreme example that points out what resentment does, right? It goes from resentment to hatred, in Saul's case, to approving of the murder of Stephen, right? And then let's look at the contrast between Saul and Stephen, right? Acts chapter 7, verse 59 tells us, then he, being Stephen, fell on his knees, right? And what does he do? What does he say? He prays, right? He prayed a couple of prayers, but one of them was, Lord, do not hold this sin against them, right? We see on one extreme Saul's hatred, that he was approving of this man's death. We see what resentment and bitterness on the extreme end does. And on the extreme end of love and forgiveness and mercy, we see an absolute contrast of Stephen, where he's on his knees getting stoned, right? Incredibly painful. And he's praying and he's saying, God, forgive their sins. Don't hold it against them, right? There we see contrasted what moving from, and he doesn't have the resentment. We see the contrast of what it looks like to be filled with the power of God. And how does that kind of love, how does that kind of moving from a hurt, right? He doesn't even go to resentment. He just goes to forgive them, Father, right? How does he do that? Well, it doesn't come from us, right? Verse 56 in Acts says, look, I see the heavens open and the Son of Man standing at the right hand of God. And that's the secret of it, right? He wasn't looking at his enemies that were stoning him. That wasn't his focus, right? Yes, he was getting hurt. Yes, we do get hurt. But he was looking upward and he saw Jesus, right? That was the vision. And the Holy Spirit was empowering him, right? That doesn't come from any of us, right? And that's the whole point. We can't do that on our own. It's impossible for us. So we see Saul's hatred led him to approve the death of an innocent man. And we see Stephen's example. He was looking to Jesus, and he was able to offer forgiveness in the moment, right? To pray for the person. Now, of course, Paul had a direct encounter with Jesus on the road to Damascus. And interestingly, right, in the idea of vision and being able to see, he had to go blind, right? He met Jesus, and he had to go blind to be able to see himself correctly, to see his own sin, his own attitudes, his own sins that he needed to give up to have God remove, right? The other thought that I had about Saul as he converted and became Paul is that, yes, he had a direct encounter with Jesus, but I imagine that Paul reflected on that moment, right? That moment where he was witness to the death of Stephen. And I'm sure that ate away at him. Obviously, he knew he was forgiven, but it was also the example of Stephen, right? He was able to look back and say, I want to be like that. I want my life to be like Stephen. When my enemies persecute me, I am going to respond with love. So we see through that when we forgive and we move from resentment to forgiveness, it doesn't just bring blessing to us and the person that we might forgive. Our brothers and sisters see that, right? They see our example and they say, I want to be like that. I see Christ, I see the Holy Spirit moving in that person, and I know that it's not them. I know that it's the power of God allowing them to forgive. So there's many blessings that come out of forgiveness. And I wanted to have us look at a few examples of what does it look like when we hold on to resentment, right? How does it affect us? How does it affect the other person? What does it look like when we allow the power of God to make us merciful on a daily basis, right? What are the benefits of that? How does it affect us, the person, and those around us that witness that forgiveness? So what do? Toward the practical application. Matthew 5, verse 44. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be sons of your Father in heaven. Right? We approach them with humility, right? And it may not be an enemy. It may be a friend that has hurt us, right? And we see them not necessarily as an enemy, but somebody that is hurtful, that we can't trust. But it says, pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father in heaven. That humility of saying, I need to rely on God's power, that humility is what allows the power of God to flow through, because God works through a humble heart. People may be more open to our desire to help when they see that our hearts have changed, right? That's the work that needs to happen inside of us before we can go into reconciliation. So I'm glad that was the topic of the previous one, and I'm glad we can kind of go back and say, what's the heart, the inner attitude? What work does God need to do in me so I can approach that reconciliation in a way that can allow God to bring forgiveness and, if it's appropriate, a restoration of that trust, right, in certain situations. So the practical application, and this is where, let's go ahead and look at the worksheet. So you can pull that out. And it's, and you don't need to write anything yet, but this is a really good exercise, or it can be if you want to use it and there are resentments in your life. And I think everybody has something, right? So it's, who am I resentful toward? And this is a column where you go down vertically. So you write the person's name. So it might be my friend, right? A certain person that has hurt me. What did that person say, do or say that caused my resentment? And you don't need to write anything yet. You can if you want to. You can write some notes. But we'll go through it in more details. But what did they do or say that caused my resentment, right? Maybe they gossiped about me, right? Maybe they said something really hurtful and put me down. They said something mean, right? Slandering, right? So then how did that affect me? And this is just the overview. I'll go into a little more detail. But did it affect my self-esteem, how I see myself? Did it affect my friendships? Did it affect security? So finances, emotions, did it affect me physically? Romantic relationships, right? I think just about everybody here is married. I understand maybe folks are dating or engaged, but did it affect that romantic relationship with my spouse? And future goals, what I want to do in the future. I have ideas, I have goals. Did it affect those things? And then, what's my part in this, right? And it has a whole list of things. So that's the basic kind of breaking down a resentment into a particular list of categories, right? So I wanted to give you an overview. Let's go through it in a little more detail, and then I'll give an example, and then I'll ask us to write it down. So the first one is, who am I resentful toward? And I've done this exercise a number of times. I find it helpful. And I had some long-standing resentments, and this and other things that God has used in my life to help me kind of deal with those resentments. So that's why I wanted to share it with you all as a tool. So when I wrote this down, I started with the first column of who am I resentful toward, and you could do it that way. I just wrote down all the list of people, right? And I did this years ago. And I thought, I'm a Christian, I'm happy, I'm generally in a good mood. But as I stopped, somebody asked me a mentor guided me through this. As I stopped and I wrote down stuff, I realized I actually have some hurts, some pretty deep hurts that I have never faced, right? And I've been holding on to these resentments until I was willing and able to face them, right? Until I'm able to see the beam that's in my eye. So one way to do this, and you could just go across this way, but one way to do it is, if you have resentments that you've been holding on to just go down vertically and say, I'm resentful toward this, toward that person, toward this, right? And it could be a parent, right? It could be my work situation. It could be my boss. It could be a teacher. It could be a pastor. It could be an entire church. I'm resentful toward this church, right? Or toward a situation in a church. It could be a school. I'm in education and I'm angry toward this curriculum. Or it might be toward a presidency. It could be anything, right? It could be whatever it is that I have a resentment towards, that would fit in that first column of who am I resentful towards. Could be a child, a spouse, anything that you could think of. I have found that as I write that list, I'm able to remember that there are resentments that I've had that I had never dealt with. So it might be that can be the Holy Spirit saying, hey, there's some work that needs to be done. Or it might be pretty clear. Boom, I know that particular person is on my list because I've had that resentment for years, right? And part of that is in the church. There's always conflict and tension because, yes, we're a church, but we're human, right? And we hurt each other. So it could be people in the church. In fact, it is people in the church, right? Let's assume that that's what it is. There's going to be tension between people in the church, and until it's acknowledged and worked through, I hold on to that in my heart. And I've got this beam, right, where I'm hurting people, when I'm walking around with that resentment. So that's the first part. And as you're doing it, right, this is the practical part, kind of be praying. Right now, say, God, please show me what resentments am I holding on to? What have I held on to for years that it's time to start letting go of that? So that's the first column. Write down the name of every person, situation, group that you can think of. I wrote this down as a guide, right? Mine was quite long. This is just, you can write it out on a white piece of paper. You don't have to use all of this if you're not a space, right? Get a notebook and just write down some more as it continues, right? If you have those. I had a lot when I did this exercise. All right, so next is write down what happened, right? And I gave examples of that. It could be, I know situations where you loan somebody money and they never paid you back, right? Right? That's something painful, that you're expecting this and they basically took from you. They stole, right? It could be maybe your parent raised you in a way that was hurtful, right? They didn't tell you that they loved you, right? Or maybe they hit you, right? There's discipline and spanking, but maybe they were abusive, right? And they went from a spanking to hurting you physically, right? Or maybe it's the way that your parents interacted. They didn't give an example of what a Christian marriage is supposed to be like. And you're like, I don't have an example of what it's like to have a dad in my life, or what it's like to see my mom and dad relate in a Christian way, right? I'm resentful toward them because of that. Or it could be a teacher, right? They said they publicly humiliated me in front of the class, right? Or a friend, right? Maybe, and this happens often as you're growing up or as an adult, right? A friend that you've known, and all of a sudden something happens to that friendship. They betray you, they talk about you, and you get deeply hurt, right? What did they do? So you write that down, right? The next part, and again, I wanted to do a high-level overview. I'm walking into it with a little more detail, so I'll spend a little more time. How did this affect me? This is really important. The first parts are kind of easy, right? You can think of the person, you know exactly what they did. How did this affect me, right? Oftentimes we don't go to that. We just say, I'm really angry at this person, right? They did this, and how could they? And I hate them, or I'm resentful, or I'm mad, or I'm bitter, right? We might not even say that. They're just a terrible person. I want nothing to do with them. But this is a really important section, these next two, and oftentimes we don't do the work here. It helps us understand and accept there's a reason why I have a resentment, or I've held on to this bitterness for years, right? Because God made us with certain needs, right? We need to have a good view of ourselves, to see ourselves in the light of Christ as people that are worthy, right? Christ died for us, and in Him we're forgiven and made righteous. So we need to see ourselves in that way, right? So maybe they've hurt our self-esteem and put us down to where we don't see ourselves as sons and children of daughters and sons of God. Maybe they have hurt the way that we see ourselves, and we have begun to see ourselves as not worthy, right? And unworthy of God's grace, right? So maybe it affected my self-esteem. Maybe it affected my friendships. I've had many friendships, and it affected those two, and maybe now I'm afraid to have other friendships because of that, right? Security. So as I mentioned, either they stole something from me, or I got fired from a job, and my financial security is threatened, or emotionally, right? I want to be calm, I want to be happy, I want to be loved, but this person is abusive toward me or says things that are hurtful, and I get sad, right? It affects my emotions. Or I mentioned the example of physical or sexual abuse, right? There's some pretty deep hurts that people in this room or whoever does these lists have gone through, right? So those are some ways that it affected me. Or a romantic relationship, right? Maybe it affected my ability to relate to my husband or wife, or if I'm dating or engaged, it affects my relationship, my prospect of getting married. And future goals, right? I want security. I want to be able to retire. I want to move up in my career, right? I want to be able to be in this position in church. I want to do this in my school, or I want to get this, right? I have future goals. We all want things that we're moving toward, and somebody's blocking us. They get in the way. They told us no. They made us look bad, whatever it is, right? It threatened and hurt my future goals. So I'm giving examples when you write down and you break down the resentment of, there's a reason why I'm resenting this person. There's a reason why I'm bitter. They have hurt me in this way. And maybe it's not just one. Maybe it's in multiple ways. Okay. And then the final part is, what is my part in this? Right? And this is where it gets difficult. Right? Because my natural tendency when I get hurt is to get resentful, to put myself on a pedestal and judge that person. The last thing that I want to do is look at my part. Right? I want to focus on what did they do. I want to get stuck on that last column that I just described. They said this about me. They stole this from me. They put me down. They hit me. Right? They gossiped about me. I want to focus on that. And we never get to the part about, well, what did I do? Right? What's my part in this? I can't see myself. I can't see how I've contributed to this. And if I can't, what happens? Right? You've all seen the court of law. With being unable to see my part, what usually happens is I'm the judge. I put that person right there in the witness stand or on at the defendant's table, and I, as the judge, say, here's the accusation. And then I move over here, and I'm the jury, and I listen to the evidence. And as the jury, I decide, yes, this person is guilty, right? In the court of law, when I look at that resentment, I always come out as the winner because I'm not looking at what did I do, what's my part. I'm not allowing God to move into me and say, what needs to change in me, right? And so I need to step off of the role of the judge or the jury, right? And I need to come level with that person and look in the mirror and look at myself. And I wrote down some examples of what my part is in this situation, and there may be more. These are just a few things, right? So was I selfish? In this interaction, did I just focus on what do I need, what do I want? So I'm being selfish, I'm taking, right? Was I dishonest? Maybe I lied to the person. Maybe I've done something, right? I told them I would be here at this time or I would do this, and I didn't. Or I deceived them in some way, right? I may have done something in that way. Maybe I was afraid. Somebody is being hurtful, but I'm afraid and I back off. Or I avoid, right? Sometimes there's a need to speak up and set limits with the person and say, hey, what you're doing is wrong, right? But I'm afraid to do that and I avoid. I let them kind of talk to me in that way without setting limits, without setting boundaries, without saying, hey, this is not okay what you're doing, right? That might be my part, is to speak up, right? And similarly, being passive. The other one might be controlling, right? As a parent, right, sometimes I love my kids and I want to guide them, but sometimes I can be controlling. And I'm like, you're going to do this right now and do that, right? And so if I do that all the time, right, I am controlling them. I'm not giving them opportunities to learn and grow and make mistakes, right? But I can be controlling in my relationship with a brother or a sister or a friend, where I just tell them what to do and try to micromanage them. What's that other person going to do? They're going to get sick of it, right? And they're going to leave the friendship or back away or say something hurtful. So maybe I was controlling in that situation. Another couple of examples are unrealistic expectations, right? If I have known this person and that's who they are, if I know that they are hurtful, the joke from earlier about the pastor that can't keep a secret, right? If I know that this person, this friend of mine, cannot keep a secret, if I go to them and tell them something in confidence, what are they going to do? Right? They're going to go and tell the world. So in that situation, I got hurt because I had unrealistic expectations of that person. I need to know who is safe and who is going to be in a good relationship with me, who's going to have a godly relationship with me. So if I have unrealistic expectations, I'm putting myself in a position to get hurt, right? So those are different ways. And some of these it's not like I've done anything wrong. It's just I have unrealistic expectations of this situation. And maybe I need to just adjust my expectations. In some of these, maybe I did something wrong, right? I directly said something hurtful, or I responded back in a hurtful way, or I told a lie to that person. So I may see my part, but I have to ask the question, right? And that's the part where I have to decide, okay, I'm willing to face this. I know I have something in this, and I say, God, please reveal to me, right? Please reveal to me what is my part in this situation. Sometimes it may have been a direct harm where I know I've done this, right? I responded in the same way. I talked back about the same person, or I showed them exactly what I wanted to do with them. So that requires going and asking for forgiveness. But sometimes it's just certain attitudes that we have, and those are the list of attitudes. So basically, let me walk you through an example, and then we'll do our own. So a couple of some of them are deeper, right? But deeper examples of hurts, but I'm just going to give a couple that are, one was kind of more surface level, another one was a bit deeper, and I'll walk us through it. So one example was basketball coach, right? I was resentful toward my coach in high school, and then when I got into college, what happened? I played basketball. It was very important to me when I was growing up, and the coach did not play me. I sat on that bench, and I did not get to play hardly any in my senior year, junior year, going into senior year. Right? It affected my self-esteem. It also affected my future goals. I was 16 years old, and I was determined I was going to play in the NBA. Right? So it affected my goals. I'm like, I'm not going to play in the NBA. What was my part in it? Right? My part was, well, I was avoidant. When I would get on the court, I was afraid. Right? He didn't play me because I would get on the court and I was afraid to play. So he's like, you sit down until you get better at it. I also had unrealistic expectations, right? I wasn't as good as some of the other players, so of course I wasn't going to get to play, right? That is uncomfortable to admit, right? But until I was able to do that, man, I held on to that resentment for a while toward that coach, right? And it seems like a silly example, but as a young college student, having just come out of high school, I thought about that, right? And I would think of this coach, and so that's an example of just walking through it. Another one that was more painful that I held on to this for years. This is the second example. And then we'll go into you all taking a few minutes to write it down. So when I grew up from, 7, 8 years old till about the age of 13, I had two best friends. We went to the same church together. We hung out, sleepovers, we did events, all this stuff. We were like the Three Musketeers, did so many things together, and I just accepted that's who we are. We hang out, that's what we do. Well, I was 13, and I went with my family to Romania. We went on vacation for about a month, and I come back, and I attend church, and these two guys were sitting over here, and there was a third person, right? There was somebody else that had gone into that friendship, and that was it. Like, the three of them hung out, and they moved on. They went and did other stuff. They hung out, and I didn't hang out. I mean, we still talked, but we didn't do things after that because they had a new circle of friends, right? I hung on to that resentment for years. Like as an adult into my 30s, I thought back on that. I'm like, these people were so terrible. They did this to me, right? And maybe we have something like that. So that's an example that it was more painful, and I didn't have the tools. I didn't know how to deal with something like that. So I just kept looking at them whenever that resentment came up, and I'm like, I'm afraid to trust people because these people let me down, right? They just got a new friend, and they moved on, and I was left in the dust, and that hurt, right? So what did I never looked at my part. I just held on to that resentment. Eventually, it made it onto this list, and I was able to see, right, that it affected me, that it's okay to feel sad. I felt hurt, right? It affected my friendships with them, and it affected my ability to make future friendships. So walking us through the list of, I put their names down, I wrote down what they did. They got a different friend, right? And it affected me in this way. Well, finally, I got to look at my part, right? My part in this was that I was passive, right? I was 13 years old, and I didn't go up to them and say, hey, I still want to hang out, right? I still want to be friends. Can we do some events together, right? I turned myself into a victim, and I said, that's it. I can't be friends with them anymore because they have moved on. Now, I don't know what they would have done, but my part in it was I didn't try, right? I just gave up. And I said, poor me, I'm a victim, and how could they do this to me? And then I realized that, looking back, I talked with my parents, they ended up, their families started hanging out. Our parents went in a different direction, and so it was outside of anybody's control for the three of us. Our families didn't hang out as often. They didn't do this to me. They just hung out more often with that particular family, right? So I made it about me. It was kind of a selfish, like, this is about me and these people, and they're out to get me. As I grew up, I got more information. I realized had nothing to do with me, or very little, right? They just moved on because it was 2-3 families that had different friendships. So that's an example of, I walked through this, and I was able to let go of some of these resentments and experience some healing. All right, so I want us to take about 5 minutes. Go ahead and grab the pen and the paper, and if you haven't, take a few minutes. Go ahead and do that now. Write down a resentment, a hurt, right? Write the person's name down, or if you're worried about anonymity, you could just write an initial, right? That's perfectly fine. And write down, just take a few minutes. I want this to be a practical piece of this workshop of, God, if there's somebody that I'm resentful toward, that I've been hurt by, that I'm holding on to bitterness, right? Please show that to me. So go ahead and take a minute and go ahead and write that down. So I'll give us a minute or two to do that. And I think there's some paper packets that were handed out. You can use that as a back to put it on and write if you need something solid to write on. Maybe I see people writing, so go ahead and take another minute or two to finish writing up, and then we'll continue. But please use this time to write it out. I mean, there may not be anything. You may have dealt with stuff. But if there are, I think most people have things that they've held on to, right? Could be the way lunch was made yesterday, or the way somebody looked at you. And as you're writing, there's plenty of copies in the front. Those of you that want to take this at home, I had a lot of resentments the first time I did this. And I'll tell you that I've experienced freedom from these resentments as I've allowed God to work through this process, right? And through understanding of what Jesus is telling us in the Bible about forgiveness and showing mercy. And there's a sense of freedom where you can go to other people and interact with them differently, having the Holy Spirit remove these resentments. Okay, so I think people may have written at least one example. Feel free to write more as you need to, and then at home throughout the coming week or weeks. So now what do we do with this list? And with this, we'll wrap up. So you've written it down. What is this process now that I've written down? Well, first of all, simply writing it through this process with some things can help me let go of that resentment. I can see, hey, maybe this was silly. I'm holding on to this. I realize that I'm holding on to this, but it's not a big deal, right? I look at my part, I was just maybe reading into what they said, or it's something that I recognize as a resentment, but I don't really want to hold on to it. Simply writing it out and saying, God, please remove this, right, can be helpful in some resentments that are just not that deep. The second thing is, when I look at my part, I can see patterns. So if I write down multiple resentments over here, right, if I look at my part and I've seen this, there's going to be things that I do regularly in these resentments. And so I can circle, and for me, I've done this a lot of times. For me, it tends to be being avoidant. I don't like conflict. So I will avoid, and I'll just kind of hold it into myself. I've had to learn in brotherly love and kindness to go and speak to that person and say, hey, this bothered me, right? Or can you explain this to me, or something like that. So I've had to learn that I tend to avoid. I see it whenever I write one of these, usually it's that. I get to learn something about myself. If I avoid, I'm called to, in brotherly love, speak up, right? And say, here's how I've been hurt. Here's how I need the reconciliation to happen between you and I. Here's what I'm asking. So that's another way that this list can be used, is that as I write down these lists, I get to see the patterns. I get to learn something about myself that I can give to God. And I say, God, here's who I am. Here's these parts of me that need to grow up, right? So that's a second way. The next way that this list can be used is as a confession, right? A lot of these resentments may have nothing to do with your spouse. This being a family conference, right, I think everybody here is with their spouse, or you are married if your spouse didn't make it today. But this is an opportunity to do confession to your spouse. And it may not be about them, right? It may be resentments about a parent, about a school, about a church. It may be resentments about whatever. But maybe you've never shared that with your spouse, with your husband or your wife. So this is an opportunity to allow God to work through that relationship. They can listen, you are sharing, and you're confessing it before them and before God, and they get to know you better, right? There's a lot of healing and connection that can happen in a relationship when I turn to my wife and I say, here's how my mom or my dad hurt me. Here's my part in this. Let me tell you about that. And I am hurt, and I need to receive God's forgiveness, right? Because they can listen and they can understand a part of me that maybe they didn't before. So this is a really good way to strengthen your own marriage, right? But it also is going to be that it's going to be a resentment toward your spouse. That is inevitable, right? We live with that person and we love them, but sometimes they do stuff that hurts us, and vice versa. So it's also an opportunity to open up the line of communication. I've written it down, I've looked at it, and instead of jumping at that person and accusing them and saying something hurtful, let me do some writing first, right? Here's what my wife did, and here's how it affected me. Of course I'm going to feel sad or hurt. She said something that hurt who I am, right? What's my part in this? Well, maybe when I got home from work, I slammed the door and went in and started playing video games, right? That's my part in this. I was being self-focused. So I get to see my part. Did somebody raise their hand with that? Was that a confession? Just kidding. So this is a very practical tool between the husband and the wife, not only to deal with resentments globally, but to deal with just the everyday stuff, right? Or, as Pastor Romeo said, maybe it's a deeper hurt, right? And that requires more work, but it's at least recognizing, hey, here's how I've been hurt. And sometimes that requires working with a Christian counselor or pastor if it's a deeper hurt in the relationship, such as mentioned like infidelity or lying or those kind of things that kind of run deeper, right? These are to deal with kind of the everyday kind of resentments that come up, and sometimes the deeper ones, to at least acknowledge them. All right, and the final thing of what I do with this list is to pray, right? There's a couple of prayers. One is, God, please forgive my part. Please forgive the sins that I have done in this situation, the way that I have contributed to this. Secondly, please help me to love this person, right? I need your help, right? Just as Stephen was looking at the heavens, he saw Jesus. I need to see Jesus in this person, right? I need to see the love of God flowing into my life because I can't do this on my own. And an outflow of that is, and this is one of the most important parts, is to pray for that person. I've gone through this whole process, and every time that resentment or hurt comes up, I pray, God bless this person. Bless whatever I want for myself. God bless their spouse, bless their kids. May they be blessed at work. May they have health. May they have a great relationship with you. May they turn to you if they're not a Christian, right? May they grow up into the knowledge of you, right? So those are examples, and you could write down the prayer. And the thing is with that is that it's work, right? If it's a deep resentment, it's going to be there a while. I've prayed it, and it'll come back, right? Oftentimes, because it's been there for years. I've had this beam that I've been holding on to for years. So with this prayer, what it requires is a daily, right? And I've done this. Every day I wake up, and I'll say, if I'm dealing with that resentment and that hurt, I say, God bless this person, bless their spouse, bless their job. May they have godly relationships. May they have health. I pray that they would get the knowledge of you, right? As you pray that prayer, you begin to feel something, the Spirit of God working in you. And if you don't, fine, pray again the next day, right? But something happens eventually. And it may be 2 days. It may be a month. It may be months. Continue to pray that prayer for that person, because that's what it says in the Bible, right? Pray for those who persecute you. Pray for those that have hurt you. So those are the three ways, or the ways that this list can be used. And I want us to focus on the work of God and the Holy Spirit, right? We do the work, but ultimately it is God, right, when we turn to Him and we seek and knock through the work of the Holy Spirit that does this in our. We have our part, but it's only the love of God that can bring the healing and the cleansing. So thank you very much. God bless.
If we have questions
I don't have answers.
for Ciprian? Very helpful. Thank you, Ciprian. Was it helpful? Prima sesiune? Like. A doua? Like this. A treia? Like this. Adică, ce vreau să spun, plecați binecuvântați, plecați îmbogățiți. A fost helpful? Amin, amin. De fapt, ce mi-a plăcut la final, și mi-a plăcut toată prezentarea lui Ciprian, dar cât de mult trebuie să depindem de Dumnezeu, cât de mult trebuie să știm că fără El nu putem. Nu putem ierta, nu putem uita, nu putem deal with the resentment, nu putem, nimic nu putem. Așa spune Ioan 15:5, despărțiți de mine, nu puteți face nimic, nimic. Dependența asta totală arată maturitatea ta ca și creștin, ca și copil al lui Dumnezeu. Când e copilul mic, depinde total de părinte, nu se descurcă de niciun fel. Părintele trebuie să facă tot, da? Și atunci el crește și se descurcă pe picioarele lui. Spiritual este exact the opposite. Cu cât ești mai matur spiritual, cu cât ești mai crescut și mai matur și mai serios cu Dumnezeu și în relația cu Dumnezeu, mai mult depinzi de Dumnezeu și nu știi și nu poți să faci nimic singur și îți declar totala dependență. E important în relația de familie și în orice relație să învățăm să umblăm în har, to walk in grace, to apply a lot of grace, to be merciful, to be forgiving and loving, like God was with us. Dacă Dumnezeu a fost cu noi, cum am putea noi să fim altfel cu cel de lângă noi? Nu-i așa? Mulțumim celor care au muncit și au prezentat, mulțumim dumneavoastră ca fiind prezenți și luând parte la lucrarea aceasta. De fapt, ideea este și viziunea este ca în Biserica Bethel să avem familii sănătoase, familii puternice, familii care cunosc calea la Dumnezeu și calea pentru iertare și reconciliere la celălalt. Așa cum spunea foarte bine fratele Romeo, când este iertare, este vorba doar de tine. Când este reconciliere, este vorba de două persoane, soțul, soția. De fapt, Biblia vorbește mult despre slujba, cum îi spune? Slujba împăcării. Și Dumnezeu a făcut această slujbă a împăcării prin Hristos. El ne-a împăcat. El este pacea noastră, care din doi a făcut unul. A dărâmat zidul de la mijloc, da? Slujba împăcării ne-a fost încredințată și nouă. Hai să o aplicăm în familie, hai să o aplicăm în relații, hai să o aplicăm în biserică, hai să o aplicăm în societatea în care trăim. Această slujbă a împăcării, așa este una din fericiri. Ferice de făcătorii de pace sau cei împăciuitori. Vedeți, e o slujbă, e o chemare, e o fericire. Haideți să ne ridicăm. Mulțumim Domnului pentru această zi minunată, pentru frații care au prezentat, special pentru fratele Romeo și fratele Ciprian. Vă încurajez în probleme de consiliere să luați legătura cu dânsii. De asemenea, vă încurajez la întâlnirile de familie care sunt periodice, așa cum vă spuneam, să participați, să fiți mult mai angajați și poate că v-ați gândit, asta nu e pentru mine, asta e așa pentru familiile tinere care nu știu nimica, eu știu tot, eu am experiență. Da, nu avem nimic, avem numai mila și îndurarea lui Dumnezeu. Da? Nu putem să ne lăudăm că ce grozavi suntem. Depindem total de El și ca o aplicație practică, poate după ce mergeți acasă, aveți o stare de vorbă cu soțul, cu soția, luați angajamente noi, luați hotărâri noi în ce privește altarul de familie, în ce privește igiena relației, în ce privește iertarea și reconcilierea, în ce privește acest foarte frumos exemplu de a avea o listă în care pui lucrurile și le vezi până la capăt și până acolo unde ești tu, ce ai făcut tu în toată treaba asta. Nu numai să dăm vina pe alții și să spunem, uite, cât m-au rănit, cât mi-au făcut. Christ is the wounded healer. The wounded healer. Isaia 5:3. Prin rănile Lui suntem tămăduiți. And He's the wounded healer. Adică noi l-am rănit, noi l-am scuipat, noi l-am răstignit cu păcatele noastre și El cu rănile Lui încă iartă, încă reconciliază, încă vindecă. Da? Haideți să fim și noi așa, în familie, în biserică și în relațiile noastre. Ne rugăm. Și ne rugăm și pentru masă și apoi mergem și servim masa. Ne rugăm cu toții.
Doamne, ne închinăm cu reverență înaintea Ta și în clipele acestea și îți mulțumim din toată inima pentru această zi binecuvântată și pentru părtășia pe care ne-ai dat-o și în dimineața aceasta, în locul acesta. Mulțumim, Doamne, pentru tot ceea ce ne-ai învățat. Mulțumim, Doamne, că ai privirea îndreptată spre noi, ne iubești și ne vrei cu gelozie pentru Tine. Dacă se spune că familia este celula societății, credem, Doamne, și afirmăm lucrul acesta că familia este celula bisericii. Ca să avem biserici sănătoase, Doamne, trebuie să avem familii sănătoase. Și îți mulțumim că Duhul Sfânt în dimineața aceasta a focalizat cuvântul și cercetarea pentru fiecare dintre noi la nivel de familie. Doamne, Tu ne știi și ne cunoști pe fiecare. Nimic nu este ascuns de privirea Ta, Doamne. De aceea îți mulțumim pentru tot ceea ce ne-ai învățat. Doamne, aspectul acesta al iertării este esențial în relația noastră, în primul rând cu Tine și apoi în relația noastră unii cu alții. Ajută-ne, Doamne, să avem un spirit iertător. Ajută-ne, Doamne, să fim cei dintâi care să inițiem împăcarea, Doamne, și reconcilierea. Știu că de la noi înșine nu putem realiza și ne-ai spus în dimineața aceasta, accentuând lucrul acesta, dar prin puterea Duhului Sfânt, Doamne, noi putem să devenim și să facem totul prin Iisus Hristos, care ne iubește și care ne vrea cu gelozie pentru sine. Mulțumim pentru frații prin care ne-ai vorbit în dimineața aceasta, te rog să-i binecuvintezi, să binecuvintezi, Doamne, pe fratele Druhora, biserica aceasta, bisericile noastre, fiecare familie în parte, Doamne, și în vremuri ca acestea, știm că săgețile arzătoare a celui rău se îndreaptă atât spre biserică cât și spre familie. Doamne, te rugăm, zădărnicește-i planurile și distruge-i lucrările. Și știm că Tu ne vei da biruința, pentru că te rugăm în numele Domnului Iisus și prin Duhul Sfânt, slăvit și onorat să fie numele acum și în veci de veci. Amin.
Încă o dată mulțumim din suflet fiecăruia dintre dumneavoastră, familiilor care ați participat și vă dorim bun apetit, poftă bună sau o masă binecuvântată. Rămâneți, vă rog, la masă, nu vă grăbiți și mai avem părtășie, mai putem vorbi între noi. Vă rog frumos să rămâneți. Încă o dată vă mulțumim din suflet și mulțumim conferențiarilor. Domnul să-i binecuvânteze. Aplaudare, mai mult decât o aplaudare,